All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second seminar series on decolonizing forced migration, political unintelligibility, reflexivity, and epistemic agency, organized by PhD students from the University of Leeds and Glasgow. This seminar series aims to interrogate the challenges of sociopolitical, epistemic, and representational issues in forced migration studies. For our today's seminar, we welcome Dr. Joris for his talk on Finding Ways Through Eurospace, African Movers Reviewing Europe from Inside. As usual, we'll have 40 minutes for Joris' presentation, and we'll open the floor for questions, comments, and reflections. You can post your questions or raise your hands. You can write your questions on the chat functions, and my colleagues will collate and coordinate questions and communicate them with Joris. Just a reminder, the seminar will be recorded, and if anyone does not want to be recorded, please turn off your, you can turn off your cameras. So I would like to invite my colleague, Suad, to do a brief introduction of Dr. Joris' work, and we can proceed with our presentation. Over to you, Suad.
Thank you, Tasfalem. Welcome again, everyone, to the second seminar of Decolonizing Forced Migration. Today we have with us Dr. Joris, who is an assistant professor at the Geography, Planning and Environment Department of Roundbound University and an active member of Nijmegen Center for Border Research. Besides this, he's involved in the Help Hands Research Network that investigates everyday border work of European citizens in different European countries. He's a member of the HERA Consortium from 2019 to 2022 that investigates the role of mobile traders in the production of marketplaces as inclusive public spaces. His work that we are discussing today is enshrined in what has been called reflexive migration studies that aim to develop theoretical and methodological approaches which can overcome the master narrative of migration, quoting Adrian Taylor. In other words, overcoming the nation states and ethnicity-centered epistemologies that still largely inform migration studies and that create particular form of exclusions and reproduces hegemonic structures. Inspired by Professor Adrian Taylor's work and study the Eurostar's mobility experiences as the pioneers of an integrated Europe, Joris will take us to explore and understand the immobility trajectories of African migrants towards and within Europe, and the ways these trajectories are shaped by mobility regimes and migration industries. By undertaking a de-migranticized approach, his work delved into the ways African movers navigate Eurospace and how they are confronted with borders, harsh mobility regimes. They find their way through different spaces by mobilizing their webs of facilitation, connection to transgress these obstacles. We look very forward to explain the upper stars are from Eurostars. The floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Suad, for this lovely introduction. It's very flattering. It's also a bit scary to hear all this information that you shared with this audience. And first of all, thanks to this collective and especially also Kara, who's, I think, joining us. We had some problems with the connection before, but she invited me for this talk. And I'm very glad to be involved in the kind of circle, because I was indeed, as Suad also explained, very much inspired by Adrian's work, Pavel's work on Euromobility, Eurospaces, Eurocities. Thinking about mobility instead of migration helps to overcome some of the, let's say, analytical deadlocks that we sometimes see in migration studies, I feel. And now with Kara, who is inspired by my work, and she's working with Adrian, I feel there's a circle here, and I'm very happy to to be part of this collective and this decolonization of academic research. I'm not sure if my book, and I will mainly talk about my book today, is the example of how to decolonize migration studies or forced migration. But I'm sure there are some elements that might create openings towards a decolonial approach in the study of migration studies. I will share my screen. Hopefully it works without problems. Let's put it this way. Hopefully it's there. If not, then please, one of the organizers, let me know.
Yeah, we can see
all
it.
working.
Okay, great. The title, Finding Ways Through Eurospace, that's the main title of the book. It's indeed with the subtitle, West African Movers, Not Migrants, Reviewing Europe from the Inside. And reviewing has a double connotation. It's somehow related to how they review constantly their own positionality in Europe, but also, I would say, how they co-produce a different Europe, a world in Europe, a Europe that is maybe both central as well as marginal in its position in geopolitics, in space, in society. What I will do today is talk about this book by reading out loud some stuff. I would like to read out loud. If you don't like to hear people reading out loud their own stuff, close your eyes, then it's more or less a podcast, and it's quite fancy these days, so that might help. But I will mainly discuss the approach behind this book, and the approach is indeed inspired by Dahinden and others who aim for more reflexivity in migration studies. That means that we need to disentangle, let's say, concepts that derive from policy making from analytical concepts, so disentangle them, that create our own terminologies might help in that respect. And I deliberately didn't call my interlocutors migrants in that respect, because there are certainly moments where they identified with the migrant question. They encountered asylum regime, they encountered difficulties with papers, but there are equally many moments where they transgressed the notion of what a migrant is all about. They transgressed the normativities of integration with their mobilities. And that's what I try to articulate today, basically. So it's a de-migranticized view on the intra-European mobility of West Africans, mainly people from the Gambia, Senegal, Nigeria. And of course, when I finished writing this book, I came across a better book on this similar topic. Afropean by Johnny Pitts is I think, the decolonial undertone that might be interesting for some of the people in the audience today. And it's really a recommendation to read this stuff. It's more like a novel, a travel diary, and not academic work, but that's might inspiring as well. And it's also a lot cheaper than my book. So if you want to read a book on intra-EU mobility from an Afropean or African perspective, there are better books than mine, probably. Okay, I will start with an entry point. An entry point that brings us to the city of Milano in Italy. And I will start here because I think it already illustrates a lot of the dynamics this book is all about. I will read out a first vignette of the book, you could say. Please give me a couple of minutes here. I don't follow the chat, but maybe some others are okay. That's the Afropean Book of Fits, indeed. Okay. Here it goes. Dudu had a bad night. In the smallest sleeping room of the apartment that he shared with one other Gambian man, he got up several times at night to search with a torch of his mobile phone for something that was missing. He again checked the small pile of papers that was placed underneath the tablecloth, and he again opened a suitcase that was stored in the only closet of the room. He went out of his bed again to have another look inside the pockets of his jacket. From my bed, that stood so close now with his bed, I saw him scratching his head, and I heard him saying, "Oh, this makes trouble." He did not say this aloud. Apparently, he thought that I was sleeping. It was the first night that I spent in this place in the city of Milano. On our way from the bus stop to this apartment, Dudu had kept on stressing that he lived in a place that was far from comfortable. He did not dare to invite his wife, who was living in Leiden, a city in the Netherlands, to this living place. However, since I was there, in his eyes, to understand the African experience, it was the best sojourn for me he could think of. And he was right. It enabled me to understand that this specific apartment in Milano can be best considered a guest house. There were two main renters of the place, but they were seldom the only people around. The guest house basically distinguishes three types of visitors. First, those who stay for only a few days without being charged. Second, those who stay for longer periods of time and who are asked for financial compensation. And third, special guests who also contribute to the house rent and whose sleeping places are guaranteed. In this week in May, I belong to the first category of travelers. But running a guest house also comes with an administrative task, and this is why Dudu had a bad night's sleep that night. One young boy from the village was about to arrive all the way from Germany to collect the papers that he had handed over to Dudu some 2 years ago. Dudu showed me the Gambian passport of this boy, but he could not find the permesso di soggiorno, the residence permit. This was crucial as the boy was coming to Italy to actually renew this residence permit. After vainly searching his apartment, in Dudu's mind, there was only one option left where the particular document could be. In his previous apartment in Milano, which was inhabited by other Gambians after he had left. Here, as he explained to me, he had stored some of his belongings. This made me think of the scattered geography of his being in Europe, having stuff spread over 2 apartments in Milano, having a wife in the Netherlands, and feeling moral duties towards his village in the Gambia. With this scattered geography comes careful navigation. He called one of his brothers, who owned a car and who could easily go to Dudu's former apartment to search for the paper there. Late afternoon, Dudu received a phone call. The young boy had arrived at the central station. Dudu still had no news from the driver concerning the whereabouts of the missing residence permit. His first reaction indicated he had hoped for more time. He decided to go home quickly, and I waited in the bar. He returned in 15 minutes with a smile of relief on his face, and he told me, "There's a big confusion. The boy who is coming is not the boy with the paper. His papers are at the other side. My brother found them, the passport and the sojourner." It appeared that Dudu looked after the papers of 3 young boys from the same village, and he had simply mixed up 2 of them. Having left his place of origin many years ago, he barely knew the next generation of travelers from his village who are moving to Europe through the back way today. The documents were given to the boy in an African restaurant. We went to the train station quite early, 1 hour before the train would depart. Dudu did his very best to be in charge of arranging the passage of the young boy. He held the ticket of the young boy, he informed us about the timetables, but he repeatedly made mistakes due to the fact that the trains and times on the electronic board shifted continuously. Instead of direction, Dudu created confusion with his authority. The young boy, however, was patient with him. It seemed that he directed his docile smile to me to tell me, "There is no need to worry. I will find my way." So here, the title comes from. Finding Ways is a continuous effort, continuous process of navigation through a web of social relations, through a web of asylum regimes, through a web of rules, regulations that remain opaque to the movers in question, and also in relation to moral duties to others in these diasporic spaces. This entry point or this vignette shows already some dynamics of mobility in place that are central to the book. But there's a problem underneath it, and a problem that I would like to unpack a little bit further with you before we discuss the empirical stuff in the book, I would say. So we'll talk about the problem and we'll talk about the book later on. So the problem. What's the problem with how we perceive or how we approach West African mobility in Europe today, in continental Europe specifically, you could say. First of all, as I already said, there is this tendency to start from the nation-state frameworks. And that comes with a kind of sedentarist logics that staying put is the norm, and integration is the end of a migration process. So integration is also related to, let's say, non-movement, non-mobility or immobility. From the very start, African forced migrations in plural are related to the root causes of migration. And here the rooted geographies, or the national geographics, you could say, are emphasized. As a consequence of these sedentary starting points or the nation-state frameworks, mobility is put in a straitjacket in migration discussions. Mobility is seen as the let's call it the exceptional migration journey from a place of origin to the destination. All the kinds of movements, mobilities are hard to link to that exceptionalized journey. So it's a reductionist version of what migrant mobility is all about. And secondly, and I'm very happy that Adrian is present here today, there is a severe and harsh segregation of debates, I would say. On the one hand, there's this field of study, and Favela is definitely the pioneer, you could say, of Euromobility studies, where mobility is seen as a process a process that contributes to the integration of a European space. And on the one hand, if we talk about mobility of the so-called third country nationals, we shift to a migration lens. So we don't see mobility anymore, but we shift to a terminology of secondary migration, of transmigration, of secondary movements, etc. As if there is a linearity underneath it. You have a point of departure, a transit, or the onward movement, and then you settle. In relation to this, migrant positionalities are somehow freezed, I would say, freezed in Europe. They are seen as the external bearers of difference, and they are not seen as co-creators of Europe. And in relation to this, there are these binaries, or you could say still binary thinking in migration studies of mobility and fixity, home versus away, precarity versus agency, that I would like to destabilize with a kind of trajectory approach. So here, for me, basically the problem more or less starts with the secondary movements of migrants definition coming from European Commissions or IOMs or whatever. I'm not so much against policy language per se, but for me the question is more, why do we, as migration scholars, copy this language? Why do we speak of onward migration, of secondary migration, of transit migration, etc.? Of course, it's speaking to a policy circle, policy arena, but is this the most suitable language or terminology that we can think of? Or could we think of new vocabularies? And the segregation of debates, and Adrian knows this, comes from a kind of parallel worlds. So the parallel worlds of the Eurostars of Adrian Favell, and the parallel worlds of the African mobility that I studied for the last 6 years or so. So the Eurostars are the pioneers of European mobility, are post-national oriented, are border transgressors, urban oriented, adventurous, not there yet, sometimes frustrated at home. They see themselves as risk takers, but seldom they see themselves as migrants, as also one of Favell's respondents claimed, Saskia here. No, I see myself as an expatriate, not a migrant. If your perspective is global, then you're not a migrant, you are a mover. Your mobility is much higher. So I use this term mover to play with this, right? To destabilize the idea that cosmopolitanism mobility is reserved for the white professional in Europe today, the European citizen, and cannot be applied to a context of asylum, forced migration, etc. One example comes from what I call in this paper the Afro stars, from Mohamedou in Bergamo, with an expired residence permit. He's making living as a classical street vendor, you could say, but at least his profile of the last 10 years, he traveled to China, South Africa for business reasons. He lived in Paris, Barcelona, Sardinia, and he was thinking of a US or Taipei as a possible next destination. And he certainly did not consider himself an immigrant of the national space in Italy. So here I start from these, let's say, linkages between a mobility-oriented field and apply it to a field of forced migration. And of course, there are tensions, and we might discuss these tensions later on. But I first would like to give a bit more detail on what this book then brings. I start with what I call a kind of trajectory approach. It's a bit different from the journey, the exceptionalized journey, as trajectories are also linked to flexible movements, short-term settlements, and it's more dynamic process. So it's an open and a dynamic spatial temporal entity that I'm focusing on. Trajectories represent the outcome of multiple intersections of aspirations of individuals, social networking, but also facilitation and control actors. So it's a whole field that is involved. So it's important to position these immobility trajectories in this field of facilitation and control. A move in time and space always, directly or indirectly, influences positions of individuals, identities, aspirations, perspectives, opportunities, levels of uncertainty or uncertainty, and legal statuses. So with the trajectory approach, I try to unfreeze the migrant positionality, you could say. And this means that I do not take stability nor precarity as taken for granted. In the book, I write about structural eventuality, coming from a French philosopher. And this also underlines that people who are considered to live rather stable lives might be unstable after some certain period of time, after some life events. And this particularly hits people with, of course, an African migration background. And then trajectories reflect the relational politics or relational notion of immobility and mobility as situation of movement and stuckness feed each other. If you feel that you're stranded, you long for movement. If you are continuously and restlessly on the move, you might long and aspire for more stability and placement. So these processes constantly feed each other, and I think that's an important starting point. I'm not going through the book chapter by chapter, but basically there are two parts of the book. First, I concentrate on navigations of how my interlocutors move through an uncertain environment of both social affective circuits, but also the more migration apparatuses elements. And second is how they contribute to a world in Europe, how they contribute to reviewing Europe from different perspectives and different places. And I would like to give you two illustrations here from the book, of course. And the first part starts from the navigations, and the second from the reviewing Europe part. And the central actors of the book are well, this are 5 young men from the Gambia. One is from Senegal, by the way, and they arrived by boat with the same boat at the same time in Italy, and from there their Eurospaces expanded from Liguria, a place where I met them. And they expanded, and it's quite interesting, I would say. They expanded in various directions. First, there was Jaja, and I knew his brother for a long time. He's living in the Netherlands, and that was my connection to him. And he basically worked in Liguria for a while. With that work, he got a permit, a residence permit, and from there he moved to Sardinia first, to the Netherlands, and the Netherlands to Gambia, back to the Netherlands, and then he lived more or less an anchored life in Sardinia again. Lamin has a different, let's say, trajectory in that sense. He worked and waited in Liguria for a while, then he moved to Switzerland, but he didn't stay permanently there. He's constantly shifting residencies between Switzerland and Italy. It creates some problems in terms of his residence permit, but he's still continuing that practice. From Switzerland, he sometimes moves between Germany and Switzerland to also analyze the German situations, as you call it, and to see whether there are life opportunities for him in Germany. Omar is more or less the typical onward mover, you could say. He stayed in Italy, he waited for the papers, then he moved to Germany to try his luck there. And also he spent a short episode in the Netherlands before he returned to Italy. Shakur, another young man of this small group, in this period of time, between 2013 and 2017, he saw no papers, no movements, and he was stuck in asylum. And this is interesting because it is this condition of involuntary immobility that these young men escaped from, tried to escape from continuously, but Shakur couldn't. He saw them all leave, all his friends moving around in Eurospace, from Switzerland back to Italy, from Germany back to Italy, and some of them visited the Gambia, and and he saw it as progress, and he saw the stark contrast with his own situation, his stagnation in the asylum procedures, and of course, if you connect to these young men for longer periods of time, so I followed them for years, you also come to speak and discuss Shakur's situation with others. So Lamin, one of his friends, commented on Shakur's situation that he felt sorry for him. He's the only one of a group of 23 people that was still in contact with each other with no paper, with no progress. And Shakur's own reflection was, again, a feeling of frustration, right? So the absence of mobility is telling here. And the question then is, what explains this discrepancy? As I just noted, they come with the same boat, enter a same asylum center, and they still have very deviating profiles or trajectories within Europe in the legal, but also in the social sense. And in the legal context, it's not only, I would say, asylum law that determines the outcome of Shakur's situation. It has to do with the script of deservingness. And this is important because one of his friends, Jaja, worked from the Caritas Center, so the asylum center, with a family. And this family was a crucial key to get documentation, to get the documents. So through this family contract between Caritas and the family, the rich Italian family, individuals were able to get the humanitarian protection paper. But Shakur refused. Shakur refused to work for this family any longer. He tried, but he refused afterwards. And his friend, Jaja, didn't understand this. He claimed that one in this situation should look for your own interest. If you can work, you can get the documents, but you need to stay here at this compound of this rich family. Shakur's perspective was different, and this is, for me, telling how deservingness plays a role in asylum narratives and documentation. So I asked Shakur, why didn't you stay with the family? Because they let you work like a slave, he claimed. And then I replied, is it? But Jaja speaks good about them. He told me that they are treating him like the family. Yes, they treat you good, he said, but you still work like a slave. And this, to me, these opposites, these seemingly opposing realities of good treatment and slavery come together in this, let's say, cozy consensus in this labor contract atmosphere with this particular family. And there are all kinds of narratives from my interlocutors supporting Shakur's perspective, that they are eating the money, that they didn't get the full salary, but a lot of money went to Caritas instead, etc. So they felt exploited in this relationship between the family and Caritas. Well, I could give you many examples of how Eurospace is expanded. I'm not going to give the full details here because I'm otherwise running out of time. But this is just another trajectory, so to say, from Italy to Spain to Germany to Marseille in France, where all kinds of formal, informal sectors intertwine. And in this case, that's why I referred to the JJC term, Journey Just Come. He was always too quick for me. The ethnographer tried to understand the mobility trajectories. He was always one step ahead. So at the time he informed me that he reached Valencia, I was moving in a week or 2 or 3 to Valencia, but then he moved on to Dortmund again. So he was still always a step ahead. And when I hope you're still with me. I can't see you. That's always a pity with these Zoom sessions, but I hope you're still with me. And when I present this work, and especially this case of Shakur and Jaja and others, these are the comments that I get. Yes, these are very interesting and dynamic stories, but they come from very young boys who have not settled in Europe. As if settlement, again, is the ultimate end phase of migration where everybody is looking for some kind of stable ground to analyze these stories. And this is interesting to me because that somehow hints at the sedentarist logics of migration studies as a field. And I always bring this counter case of 3 older men in his mid-40s from a space in Catalonia, Lleida, where I met them in April 2015. And from there, the spaces of Pap, Babacar, and Mustafa also expanded in similar ways. And I'm not going to provide the details, but it's important to understand that these dynamic stories of locality, mobility are not reserved for the recent arrivals. So Pap, Babacar, and Mustafa are 3 Gambian men. Pap already fantasized about his pension, so they have a different life phase, you could say. And of course, I'm speaking here only about men. We come back to the gender question later on, perhaps also with some questions from the audience. Interestingly, in this storylines of these 3 men, they zigzag through Europe, between Europe and Africa, and then at a certain moment in time in April, usually in April or March, they come back to Lerida, Lleida again. And this is the time for communication, for the time to contact employers in the agricultural fields around Lerida to see whether there's work, but also to check whether the friends, the brothers, sisters are still around or are still in Africa or still in France or Germany or wherever. So there is an agricultural rhythm here that needs to be taken into account. But I would like to focus on one particular incident of these three older men, you could say, in Eurospace, and it's the disappearance of an Afro star. Babacar, who moved to the Gambia after the agricultural season ended in Spain, he bought a van there to start a taxi business in the Gambia. He stayed for a couple of months there. He went back to Spain, checking with the patron, whether there was work in the agricultural fields. There was none, so he moved to Milano. And there I met him one day in the same guest house I was talking before, the guest house of Dudu. And he was working there as a street vendor, doing all kinds of businesses, informal businesses. And I was wondering why he opted for doing this in Italy, not in Spain. And he said this quite rationally, you could say, because in Barcelona, we have this control all the time. If they control me, they can take my paper and then I have a problem. So I was impressed with his navigation of Eurospace in that sense. But after that, he also referred to the openness of things, the openness of his horizon, by saying that before he visited Dudu, his friend in Milano, he didn't think of these economic activities, etc. But after that, Babacar disappeared for several months, for many months actually, not only from my radar, but also from the radar of Dudu and many of Babacar's friends. And Dudu assured me that he was doing fine, otherwise he would have known. He just disappears, he said, you cannot reach him by WhatsApp or Viber, he just disappeared. Like magic? I replied, yes, it's like magic, he confirmed. And then all kinds of rumors in his social networks starts to pop up, right? Some friends in Spain was telling me, I think he's about to move to Belgium. Other friends in Spain, I think he's in Italy. His friend in Italy said, no, I think he's in Spain. Another friend in Tenerife, I think he's going back to Africa. So where is Babacar is the question, not only for me, but also for his social circuits. And here I would like to read the last passage before I conclude of my book. Let me see where it is. It's so scary, this silence. I don't know if you're still present or whether you're sleeping or, but anyways, I will read this.
We're here.
Okay, thank you.
Still here.
In the beginning of May 2017, I went to see Dudu again in his place of anchorage. On a Sunday afternoon, I arrived at Milan Central Station. After our mutual greetings, Dudu told me that Babacar was also around and that I would see him in the house. I was happily surprised. For about 8 months, I had tried to reconnect with him, and now he just reappeared without further notice, indeed like magic. During my subsequent conversations with Babacar, it appeared that there was a lot of truth in the rumors about his whereabouts in the last 8 months. He indeed spent a short time in Belgium, from where he indeed traveled back to Spain, and now he was indeed in Italy. Babacar's mobility reflects a form of detachment that's discussed by Abdulmalik Simon in the framework of urban informalities. With his movements, Babacar refused to be fixed, socially and politically. For him, disappearance, characterized by opacity, was a right to be claimed. This became once more clear from his reflection on his Flixbus journey from Spain to Belgium. At the French-Belgian border, the bus was stopped and the border police asked him some questions. One of the questions was how long he planned to stay in Belgium. Babacar replied in all honesty, maybe 2 days, maybe 2 years. These mobile circuits, as argued before, constitute a world in Europe. A Europe that's always multiple in Balibar's words. Because these circuits never stand still, versions and interpretations of Europe also shift constantly. From the perspective of the movers, we see a Europe that is and might be. It's a Europe that's both central and marginal. It's a Europe that's characterized by both cross-border mobility, Schengen, and by its fight against it, Dublin. With regard to the latter, Europe aims to find the right policy measures to differentiate on the basis of deservingness, who deserves to stay, entitlement, who is entitled to move, and administrative emplacement, where the movers belong. In this question of bordering and ordering mobility, Europe seems to be desperately looking for transparency and clarity. The irony, however, is that when one gains more knowledge on what drives African movers to cross borders, or where they really go and how long they intend to stay, the picture does not necessarily become clearer. This irony revealed itself in the conversation between Babacar and the border guard in the French-Belgian borderland, discussed above. When he recounted this incident, Babacar started to laugh. When he remembered the puzzled face of the border guard, hearing his reply of maybe 2 days, maybe 2 years. With his reply, Babacar claimed the mobility and hence his Europe that both is and might be. Okay. Some final reflections. In a way, this book, in the end, claims for a space in migration studies and mobility studies that start from analytical openness. Of course, I see a lot of structural issues, a lot of institutional violence, a lot of racism, a lot of barriers, borders in the stories that I collected. But I didn't start from the structural notion of precarity, because I've seen also equally many escape routes, many tactics, many transgressions, you could say, that that would equally create a kind of violence, academic violence maybe, when we would portray these people as let's say only the subjectified bare lives, etc. So this analytical openness is a claim to follow processes of both success and failure and the thin line between them, of both here and there and the thin line between them. And I think this is important to go beyond some rigid elements of starting points of migration studies. What these trajectories also show, I would say, is that these mobility stories, or these tendency to be mobile, to stay mobile, are not without any grounds. They are not ungrounded, not placeless. There are always mobility locality configurations at play. They might be very dynamic, but there are anchorages. And here I would like to come back to the place where I started from, Liguria, when talking about these 5 young men. In my last episode of fieldwork, I went back to the same place, to visit Shakur there. And to my own surprise, most of the young men I knew from the place returned to that place in 2018. Some for administrative reasons, to renew the documents, some for work, some for social reasons, etc. So it's not that they are placeless in Europe. It's not that we can simply see them as the drifters, or let's say the opposite of the settler type of migrants. In my latest work, I also reflect on what I do. So this book is based on the trajectory ethnography, in which I try to follow people across within places for longer periods of time. And I saw some recent papers where this notion of following people is getting a kind of nasty twist. Some mention methods like shadowing, or see following as a method of disengagement. And I would so it's important to reflect also how this argument of following trajectory, how it resonates in other people's work, and there are also some tensions that I think are important to address. So in my view, this work of understanding the unfolding of trajectories, whether they have become immobile or mobile, and the thin line between them, the relations between them, starts from engagement, starts from long-term engagement, and not from a kind of disattached researcher shadowing his subjects. And then COVID came, and Brexit came, and many other elements came that makes this period of time, a very weird time to promote or speak about a book that starts from mobility and relations to localities. But it's important also to think how COVID also changes the landscape of mobilities of these African movers. And I know for some it really hampered movement, so they felt immobilized by COVID. Others felt still the urgency to keep on moving because it was a question of survival, you could say. So if you are interested in this more reflection of what this trajectory approach or following approach is doing and what the pitfalls ethically are, then I would like to also refer to a wonderful special issue that my good friend Kola Aparna and Cesar Melin and I co-authored. To talk about the academic backstage is also to talk about the uncertainties, ambivalences, and politics that come with methods in migration and border studies. Okay, I'll leave it at this, and I look forward to your questions, and many thanks for this invitation.
Thank you, Joris. Thank you very much. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Now we would like to open the virtual floor to reflections, comments, and questions. So as I say, you can write your questions in the chat function. You can also raise hands and address them directly to Joris. Oh, the floor is open. If you have any questions, yeah, Suad. Okay, look, if I may, then I would like to start with one question, Joris. I can take the platform. I read a book, I think, which was published in 2018, and the authors tried to make a distinction between mobility and movement. Mobility conceptualized as movement with access, with resources, with pleasant experiences in terms of how people navigate borders, for example. But or on the other hand, movement is more conceptualized as a physical movement, where someone moves from one place to another place, but without all the pleasantries, the positive experiences of negotiating and communicating with different immigration authorities as people across borders, for example. I was wondering if we can talk on your framing of intra-EU movement of African migrants as mobility. Do you think that it might be problematic if we conceptualize this as mobility? Because with their movement from country to country, we could argue, I think, there is no the positive experiences of just moving from one place to another place with all the positive experiences, the luxury in terms of time, in terms of how people navigate those border crossings.
Thank you, Tesfanem, for this thought-provoking question, I must say. Yes, there are different conceptualizations of what movement is, what mobility is, and what the difference is. I would start from, or I always have started from Tim Creswell's work on mobility that makes a parallel to a discussion in human geography, at least, the difference between locality and place. Locality is more or less the geographical location of a place, and the place becomes with certain experiences. It's lived. It's with an identity. It's also with politics. And here I would say, if you follow that parallel, movement is a bit of the, let's say, the empty version of mobility, in the sense that it lacks the connotation of politics, experiences, and attachments. So that will be my reply to you. And of course, it has been a deliberate choice to put a mobility framework to these discussions, for the reason that I mentioned at the very beginning, is that we try to miss a lot. We miss a lot when we only apply migration frameworks to this study of African positionalities in Europe, so to say. So if we, that's my impression at least, if we would like to do justice to the lived realities of these young men and women that I encountered, a mobility framework is more enriching in that sense, in terms of also the political questions, in terms of how people sometimes identify with a migration label and sometimes transgress it, etc. I'm happy to hear the authors of the book, by the way. If you put it in the chat, that's fine.
I will share that with you. Thank you. Yeah. The floor. The room is full. Would be good if.
Glenda has a question, I think.
Yes. Hi. Let me see if I can turn my camera on. Hi. Thank you so much for. Hi. Thanks so much for a very interesting presentation. I haven't read the book yet, but I look forward to reading it. So I have a question, but it comes just out of kind of response to your presentation. But I look forward to engaging more with your work through the book. And my question connects to the point that Spalem, I think, was raising. And I guess the question is, I'd like to understand more about the analytical openness that you're talking about, which I very much welcomed in terms of the creativity that you put into rethinking, our vocabulary, and that's, I guess, the militant contribution that you're posing for us today, right? And particularly, I'm curious to understand how you are. What is the openness that you're seeing in talking about movers and not migrants? And I'm very well aware of the literature you're referring to, and I appreciated in the stories that you shared with us, in the lived stories you shared with us, how you envisioned these different stories speaking to life experiences of people who move about and move around. But I wonder how, what is the analytical openness, or what's the analytical purchase? What is the intervention that you're suggesting we should try to work together towards in migration and refugee studies, so within the discipline, so to speak, that you're trying to point at with the notion of movers, which seems to me strips away from the discourse or gets rid from the discourse those who are not allowed to move, those for whom the visa regime, imposes an immobility, those who didn't make it, those who died before being able to displace themselves back and forth or zigzagging across Europe, or those who can't move. We know that migration is a very expensive experience, afforded only to some. We know that people with disabilities or women, all these barriers that I'm sure, are well known by all of us. So I'm curious about your analytical openness. If you can tell us more about the notion of movers versus migrants, I guess the epistemological intervention you're making for us here.
Wow, Glenda, thank you so much for this
No, thank you.
powerful for this powerful question, because this is indeed it puts the finger on the right place, in the sense that this was also my my hesitance to choose a different label. All right, so there's always any term you would pick creates also pitfalls, and this is definitely a pitfall, especially since we know that it leads to a mortality, let's say, and with that, I would say that openness is not should not be confused with progress or solutions. So it's not that it's claiming upward social mobility or policy openings or whatsoever. It rather leads to an argument of intersections, how vulnerability and resourcefulness are sides of the same coin, how dwelling and moving interrelate, how individuality and collectivity interrelate, and so it's not about let's say it's not a progress connotation. It does lead to frictions, I would say, and Anat Singh's work is I think important here. Frictions that might lead to new arrangements of culture and power and whatever, no? And I think that's how I would see it. So therefore, I still well, I opted for the mover terminology in this book. But of course, you're definitely right that it oversteps experiences of immobilities quite crudely, you could say, of people who can't move. But also there, I think, immobility is what I've seen, and I've maybe been in the wrong places. Well, in my earlier work, I've been in Morocco and Turkey, and I've seen a lot of immobilized trajectories, you could say. But these are, for most of them, phases and not a structural condition. So phases in life and not a structural condition. As so that's what I can say. And there was someone else that I wanted to mention. Maybe it pops up. Oh yeah, now I remember. I tested this label also with my interlocutors, but also the families, because I was in the Gambia in 2017. And now I refer to a bit of a different term, but I get some similar comments when I use the term Afro-stars, for instance, that I use in some of my papers. And then this uncle of one of my interlocutors in Europe, I asked him one day, what do you think of the term Afro-stars? Is it useful for my book, etc.? And he said at the time, Afro-stars. Well, if I look at the stars, I miss them. So it's a good title. And I think this element of this affective element of certain typologies or terms that we use might also be, let's say, find a place in the words we pick. Maybe it doesn't count for the movers term. And I deleted many times the word mover in my book later on, but it still appears in the title. Yeah, it's a good question, Glenda. Thanks. Hope it helps.
I think we have another question from Dr. Roxana as well. Can I invite you, Dr. Roxana, to?
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for this presentation and to Tesfalem and the colleagues organizing it. My question is to talk a little bit about methodology, because you've mentioned a little bit about the challenges around stalking and following up. And I remember for those doing research about the migration crisis, there was a lot of conversations about apps following, using technologies to do that. But it's a very, very special relationship when you do qualitative work that is ethnographic in nature. You spend time, you follow them in time. You're witnessing and experiencing things with them. you're part of those emotions, your experiences as well, injustices, you're afraid for them when they cross the border, when you don't know when they disappear. So just if you could share with us a little bit about the methodological difficulties and how you navigated them, or how you answer these methodological challenges.
Roxana, thank you. Yes, injustices we encounter when we do this kind of work, we do this kind of research, and that hits not only, of course, the researcher, but more importantly the people in question, of course. And there are a few things I think I can say about this. First, it's highly self-selective in the sense that I could only follow for a longer period of time in this intensive way particular people on the basis of liking each other, right? Because otherwise you do not pick up phones, or you do not inform when you go to another place, etc. So it's also highly self-selective and far from any representative study or whatever. That's one. But the emotions and the navigation of emotions is a challenge constantly. And some of the people I know for over a decade, and some of them I visit regularly. They come to my home here, and I've seen them on my marriage ceremony. I went to theirs, etc. So it's a bit of a relationship that goes beyond any research, but it complicates also questions, because those people who have become in my inner circle of friends, I could say, I don't raise the questions I would raise to others sometimes. So it also silences a lot of information at times. So it's a bit of edgy, you could say. And in terms of relationships, I also moved from, let's say, in my PhD years, from a concern of if I support them, then it affects da 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 da. But hell, it's really the opportunity to also engage with people in very difficult circumstances, and to see where you can help, or see where you can improve, or to see where you can engage. And I think that's also important to engage and to be not afraid in that sense. And yeah, I hope that's part of the question, Roxana. If there are more particular questions on ethnography and mobility, I'm also happy to reflect on that. But,
yeah.
Thank you, Roxana. Thank you, Yoris. Yeah, Suad.
Suad, you're on mute. If you have a question to read, yeah.
I think there was a question by Bournemouth that he wanted to ask it directly to Yoris. The floor is all yours. Yeah.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, my name is Nicola. Sorry, that's my email address there. So thanks for the very interesting presentation, and for the very interesting discussion that is emerging from the question. And one thing that came to my mind from Glenda's question was also about how we accounting for temporality is key to discuss the different mobilities. So the qualitative different mobilities that are afforded across different legal status, social status, and other categories of difference, of experiences of difference. My question is very boring, I'm afraid, and related to literature. And what you were discussing, especially at the beginning, about the kind of unsettling binaries and the kind of global engagements that the interlocutors in your research were having, two things came to my mind. Came to my mind Nina Glick-Schiller, diasporic cosmopolitanism, and Eric Vigh idea of global awareness from below. So my question, very boring, is to what extent you have engaged with these concepts, and if you realize that they were not really apt to what you were aiming to do, why? That
I know there are different versions of cosmopolitanism from below. In that sense, I opted for Abdul Malik Simon's work on the worlding of worlding as a kind of indeed a positionality that's both about connectivity, switching gears in terms of movement, especially in relation to African positionalities, and there I think there is also a thread of literature that I also incorporated, which that hampers somehow cosmopolitan beings. So on the one hand, they do relate and they do see all kinds of world immobilities also in their direct environments. But there are visa regimes, as also mentioned earlier today, that block their access to the same globality or same cosmopolitan world from the departure places. Or so the first chapter is called "Worlding Departures," and that in that chapter I outline this version of, on the one hand, a worlding positionality, cosmopolitan identities, and on the other hand, a general feeling of involuntary immobility and abjection as a kind of condition in West Africa, at least.
Thanks.
Thank you, Luca. Thank you, Joris.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure,
we'll now invite Professor Adrian Favel. I think you've raised it now.
Yeah. Okay. Hi. Yeah, I mean, obviously, you know, it's great to hear the relationship between this work and the work on Eurostars, and I love this kind of analytical inversing of you know our perspective by, you know, how looking at a group that you expect to sort of see within a different sort of lens, i.e., you know, under the you know, under the lens of sort of domination and marginality and so forth, sort of portrayed in this way. But I think we need a kind of bit more of an exploration of Glenda's question, which I think opens up all of the issues around, you know, what exactly this group of movers and migrants have. And you know, it's interesting. You think of it in relation to the Eurostars that I wrote about. The point about that, their freedom and mobility, is that despite all of the privileges they have, in the end, their lives and experiences turn out to be heavily nationalized. And the biggest irony of all, of course, is that the ones who went to Britain, you know, ended up, you know, 3.5 million of them being, you know, forced into becoming immigrants, despite their ability to, you know, to be free movers and mobile and so forth. And you know, so turning around back, looking again at your group, you know, we want to kind of know more about what it is that they have that enables them to resist this kind of you know, scenario, the scenarios that are being laid out in terms of immigration and integration, of settlement. You're giving us lots of examples of resistance. And I'm thinking of this in terms of the sort of, you know, James Scott type of framework. I mean, I think this is how we should be thinking of it, is, you know, these are examples of resistance against domination and the positioning that's being forced on them, and that is incredibly powerful, you know, within the nation state context. And it's surprising, and we're a bit suspicious of it, because we think that it doesn't accord with our sense of power and, you know, the conventional dynamics, which we all know are there, all of the things that Glenda mentioned. But I do think you need to, tell us a bit more about what it is these guys have that enables them to do this, and that differentiates them from, you know, other people in very similar positions who don't have don't have these things. There's obviously, obviously it's something to do with them, the fact that they're male, that they're young, perhaps. I mean, you do have some older people. They've got certain sorts of attitudes. I think it does point to a porousness that is very interesting, and which I think is associated with all immigration and all forms of migration into Europe, even at the most kind of dominated end of things. But we kind of need the continuum of other characters that are not in the story in some sense, and some sort of analysis of the resources or social power that they have, despite the positions that they're in, and how that has worked, and maybe how that changes over time in relation to, when a border comes clunking down, or when something happens externally that changes the circumstances. Most of your talk emphasized the resistant ability that they had to escape these things, as opposed to the moments when things went wrong. Whereas the Eurostars story is all about, really, in the end, it's all about how mobility goes wrong, basically, and how European nation states, in fact, have been able to kind of close a lot of the opportunities of free movement, even when people have lots of freedom and privilege and human capital and so forth. If you see the point, I mean, I think it's the point about the it's precisely Glenda's question about the analytical, where the analytical sort of extra thing that you're giving us.
Let me try, Adrian. Thanks for this additional layer, you could say. What are the particularities, or what are the characteristics of this particular group? Although I'm not sure if this is such a particular group, but let me try to align certain elements. What's different from the Eurostars is that they came from a setting where there was no identification with whatever European nation state. So they were not born as Portuguese, British, whatever. So that's one. So they enter Europe without that rootedness, you could say, the national thing. Second, there is a family. I think that's also a very interesting aspect. And in relation to that first point, I think there's a fantastic case also in my book. It's from a Nigerian woman called Julie, from a mixed marriage with a Dutch man. And Julie decided to relocate to London while her husband stayed in the Netherlands. And Julie accused her husband for being too rooted, too Dutch, and immobile. And I think that is somehow the first point that I hinted at. But that relates also to families. Julie had I think a child of 9 years old at that time, and he entered schools. A lot of the men I was talking about today have the families, if they have families, wives and children, in West Africa. So that matters in terms of flexibility, in terms of navigation capacities, you could say. Thirdly, there is labor. So what is perhaps different from Eurostars is that they are in an European economy where short-term contracts, no contracts, are the rule rather than the exception, and therefore I think the agricultural undertone in the rhythms of the Catalan case is telling, because there's a cycle in that sense that in April, March, a lot of people come back to the same places that they came from after their wanderings in Europe, you could say, and this is related to short-term contracts. Similarly, in tourism in Italy, I've seen the same thing. No, it's around the beach areas where job opportunities are there for a couple of months, but not for the full year. And this relates to a fourth element that is a kind of historicity of a multiple, let's say, a livelihood framework in development studies, often called how they're used to live in environments of uncertainties, and that created already a multiplicity of activities. So they were miners and farmers, they were taxi drivers, and no. And I think that multiplicity, I think, is somehow different from a lot of European professions or the professionals you're talking about in your book, Adrian. And that makes I think interesting to create a certain parallel to mobilities outside the European continents, and therefore I co-authored a piece with Mathieu Bollet and Janine Dahinden. But Mathieu worked on miners in West Africa, and we see a lot of parallels there. How itinerant miners move across spaces, sometimes across national borders, across different settings, with different tactics. And these similar tactics I see somehow in Eurospace. And I think these parallels are quite interesting to go further. So there are, yes, certain elements that might be characteristic for this group. Although I'm reluctant to speak about groups, but about these people I talk about in my book. Yeah.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, Joris. If we have 10 minutes before we can conclude. So if we have, I think we have some time for maybe one or two questions or comments, if there's any. Yeah. Well, so do you have any? Okay. Well, in this case, then maybe I can ask, I think, a final question. Then I think, and my question is, Joris, it's about maybe if you could talk about your observations, your experiences of migrants imagining Europe from outside and revisiting Europe from within. Any parallels or any reflections on that? And if you could share.
A great question again. Some authors create kind of caricature of the would-be migrant from Africa, that they think that money grows on trees in Europe, etc. I don't like this caricature in that sense, and I also don't think that people are naively starting a journey without taking into account the possible risks during a journey towards Europe. So that's already some hints at well, maybe towards an answer. But that said, I came across a lot of severe and deep frustration, disappointments about what Europe has to offer in terms of institutional protection, in terms of economic opportunities, in terms of freedoms. And chapter 4 is talking about the system, which is a kind of Babylon system. So it's not only bureaucracy they relate to, but also specific normativities, unspoken normativities and exclusions that are that they face every day, and also xenophobia and racism are so hitting in some of these stories. So disappointment and frustration, and some still have hope for a better Europe and try to produce a better Europe once they have entered it. Yeah.
Thank you. I think maybe this will close our seminar today. So again, I would like to thank you, Joris, for your wonderful presentation, to all the contributors, comments, questions. Thank you everyone for coming, joining us today. Thank you also to UNESCO Chair for Refugees Integration through the Language and Arts, colleagues Laura, Bella, and thank you to my colleagues here, Soad and Khaira. Thank you very much. We would like to invite you for our third seminar, which will take place on the 9th of March. We have shared the link on the chat function. Thank you, everyone, and have a very good evening.
Thank you, Tasfanem. Thank you so much. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.